So Russia has triple fucked themselves. They're going to have sanctions with them as far as they're selling petroleum. They're going to have sanctions with them as far as their trade agreements. They're going to have a bunch of companies that are like, we don't want your armament anymore. It clearly put into use against American armament. You guys could not stand up to them. Even if they win, they lose. That was my issue with this whole thing, because in the end, you had President Putin. He goes off and he lies to the entire world and says he's not going to invade. And then he invades. And while, again, great statecraft, incredible military strategy, absolutely terrible when it comes to diplomacy, you're going to have to pay for that in the end. When you tell the world that you have hypersonic missiles and then you have the Ukrainians shoot down those hypersonic missiles, turns out they're not hypersonic missiles at all. When you tell the world that you have Sukhoi 57s that are supposedly better than F-22s and F-35s, and it turns out you don't even use them in battle. When you tell the world that you have these incredible S-14 tanks that are supposed to be able to knock out anything, and they're just getting blown up on the side of the road. Russia has lost 1,500 tanks in this war already. That's incredible. Just for size and ratio, the United States lost 80 M1 Abrams tanks during all of their invasion of Iraq the entire time, and 63 of them they put back in service. What's happened with Russia is, I don't want to get too far into this, but there's this huge design defect with the tanks where they put the shells right next to the turret, and when you hit it with a javelin, then all of a sudden it blows up the entire tank. And you can see photographs all over the place. Look it up yourself, with tanks with the turrets like knocked off. And this is another problem. So now Russia, their second biggest export, which is military defense, nobody wants to buy their Sukhoi 27s because they don't work. Nobody wants to buy their tanks because they don't work. They don't want to buy the T-52s, the T-72s, the T-90s, the T-80s. Nobody wants to buy these tanks. So Russia has triple fucked themselves. They're going to have sanctions with them as far as they're selling petroleum. They're going to have sanctions with them as far as their trade agreements. They're going to have a bunch of companies that are like, we don't want your armament anymore. It clearly put into use against American armament. You guys could not stand up to them. And then finally,
do you think tanks have done well on either side?
I think tanks are going to do really well when those 31 M1 Abrams show up in Ukraine in a couple months. I think tanks are going to do really well. A T-72 cannot do anything to an M1 Abrams. It cannot, and that's going to be a serious problem for Russia.
I don't think it's a tank on tank issue though. It's
a javelin on tank,
landmines and helicopters and things.
Yeah, but
I don't think the Leopard 248 is a bad tank. I just think any tank that walked into a field of landmines that's getting targeted by drones and Hornet missiles and helicopters and anti-tank personnel is going to get destroyed. We're not having giant tank versus tank battles. It's not World War II.
We had one. We did have one in, I forgot what the city was, but there was a massive one, in the entire Russian tank brigade was lost.
Volgograd, but they lost the tanks to Ukrainian landmines and things.
But my point is this: like, one of the issues that Ukraine, and by the way, it was Prigozhin, how you say his name? He was the one who actually said this. But this is before the coup, the attempted coup, whatever it was. He actually was talking about how the Ukrainian military, which by the way has been trained in large part by the United States. I wouldn't even possibly deny that. And by the way, Ukrainian fighter pilots right now, while we're speaking, are training at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, to fly those jets, those F-16 squadrons that they're about to get. My point with that is that, like, he actually said Ukrainians use doctrine of mechanized infantry along with tanks, along with aircraft. They're using them together. The Russians don't do that. The Russians will just run a bunch of tanks into a certain place, or they'll just use artillery, or they'll just use air power, and they don't have the ability to coordinate. That was Prigozhin who said this. And so my point is, this whole thing is like, even though you have a country that is 4 times bigger than the other country, this should be a first round knockout. This should have ended in the first week. The fact that we're at a year and 5 months, I think this is a really, really bad experience for Russia. And I don't see any way for them out of this without.
So you think Ukraine is winning the conflict?
It's like this. If I'm the underdog and we're tied, I'm winning the conflict. Do you understand what I'm saying?
But you think it's tied?
Well, no, but the thing is, right now, well, just so you know, when you have an invading force going up against a defending force throughout history, the invading force loses more people. They just do, because it's just harder. Their supply lines are further. Also, if you have an invading force, let's just say for every person that's fighting, you need 3 behind them in support. So we're talking about medical, we're talking about logistics, we're talking about fuel, we're talking about food. For the invading force, you need about 7 or 8. Okay. That's a really reductive way to look at it. Okay. But you need more than twice as many people to invade as you do to defend. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. Of course.
So the problem is with the attrition situation, you have one country that has it. You notice how Ukraine is not trying to defend the whole country. They're trying to defend Kiev more than any other part.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, you have an unlimited budget. We can all agree to that, right? Ukraine has more money to spend than Russia.
Yeah.
Do you guys disagree with that?
They have the
100%.
pockets of
Well,
all
they
of
have
Europe
the
and the
US
US.
as
Yeah,
well.
correct. So just
So-
for people to understand, Ukraine
you're
NATO has a $1 trillion defense budget. That's including the $800 trillion that they get from the United States, and Russia has an $80 billion defense budget. I'm sorry, 1 trillion versus 80 billion.
Yeah.
So it's about 12 or 13 times as much. Ukraine has a blank check. The United States is giving them javelins. If you think this is wrong, if you think this is morally wrong, I'm not here to have that argument. My point is, if the United States is giving them top tier anti-tank weapons, 2 squadrons of F-16s, and their first battalion of M1 Abrams tanks that Russia has no chance against, God forbid if they bring F-35s into this, I just don't see how Russia can win. That's my point. Okay.
I disagree with that, all of it. I don't, I'm not big on the US's wonder weapons. They thought that would be the HIMARS. They thought it would be the Javelins. They thought it would be the Leopards, and they're all just getting destroyed. I think the war of attrition, like I do agree, they're not going to run out of money because they have NATO money.
Yeah.
So they're not going to run out of money. It's going to be hard to make them run out of toys. They might run out of ammo temporarily, but they're not going to run out of stuff because NATO will keep giving them things.
Agreed.
They will run out of personnel.
Possibly, but I think they have better trained
attrition
personnel.
war. I think they were trying to set up a porcupine, and they thought that the sanctions were going to be. Even Russia thought this too, that the sanctions were going to be way more devastating than they were. They were pretty much ineffectual, and they thought if we can bleed them with sanctions and force them to charge into well-fortified, bunkered, entrenched positions, it would be Pyrrhic victories at best. And Ukraine has been extremely tough, extremely resilient. And in the beginning of the war, they did have very, crack defense, and they kind of pussyfooted their way in with 90,000 troops. But Russia was looking at it, holding back, because they also didn't know whether or not they could deal with the sanctions. Without the clock on their side, because they're not in a hurry, they don't have to, they're not bleeding from sanctions. They decided to go with the meat grinder approach instead of the blitzkrieg approach. They're going to sit back with artillery, the very slow, methodical way.
That is what Russians are good at.
Where you can destroy them at range. You don't lose a lot of personnel because you're hitting them from further away than they can hit you. It's a very slow way to do it, but they've got all the time because the sanctions are hurting NATO more than they're hurting Russia. And Ukraine is running out of personnel.
Because I disagree.
The sanctions are hurting NATO more?
Yeah, because the reason why I disagree is because we've already had China denounce what's going on in Ukraine. So that to me, China is going to be.
Yeah, and I think Russia's done some funny things, I think, with their currency and everything, with disallowing people to sell Russian currency. And they're doing ways to try to artificially inflate like the economy they have. But I'm pretty sure most experts agree there's been like a pretty big contraction of the Russian economy.
It's been 3% a quarter for Russia's GDP over the last couple of years.
It's already a country that's got pretty poor, I think, in terms of GDP per capita. Like Russia is not the richest country in the world.
Russia is about as wealthy as Mexico, and a lot of people don't realize that. Russia is right on point. Russia has a smaller GDP than Italy.
I don't think you can judge the real economy just by GDP numbers.
But what I think is you can judge how well you can replace tanks and replace aircraft and replace anti-tank weapons with economy. And then once your biggest secondary supplier,
they're out of 155 millimeter ammo, even like NATO's supply. That's why they went to cluster ammunitions. They don't have enough artillery shells to shoot. And Russia's able to do that around the clock. And they're not running out of supplies. They've been preparing for this for a while.
I'm pretty sure, haven't we used like 2 million of the 20 million artillery shells we have in stock? I'm pretty sure we just haven't shipped the rest yet. And then even if we do exhaust our supply, can Russia, the country, out-manufacture the rest of the Western world when it comes to artillery shells?
Yes, they are.
I don't think they can.
And anti-air defense too. And like the F-16s, Syria shot down the F-16 by very well-trained pilots from the Israelis.
For sure.
With an S-200.
Yeah.
Now you have less trained Ukrainian pilots versus well-trained Russians with S-400s and above. I don't think they're going to be a game changer either. They're going to get shot down.
Yeah. So the difference with the Israeli thing is the United States is going to supply those F-16s with anti-radiation missiles that can fire at more than 60 miles. I think the S-400 is in deep shit, and they don't have any S-400s in country.